Unscripted Art Studios paint and chat, and today we're working on a new painting that's on birch panel, and it is 40 by 30 centimeters. And I've done quite a lot of work on this already with acrylic, and what I've done is lots of layers and then sanded back each time to sort of blend in the previous layers. So the first layers was very sort of abstract, and the later layers I started to paint more of a sort of recognizable beach scene, and then I've blended them all together, and I'm going to carry on with it even though I've found it a bit difficult and not been that keen on it, and I threw my last painting in the bin. I'm going to move on to this one and just see where we can take it. So I'm going to start off, I think, with some ultramarine in acrylic and go sort of on the shadows of these blue patches here that are the lower half of the painting, and see if we can make like basically a shadow on them. You can see my ultramarine. I'm just going to take the lid off, and I'm just going to use finger painting for this. A little bit of acrylic paint just fell on the painting, so we'll get rid of that. So this is ultramarine blue, and I got my yogurt pot lids that I collect, and then I can rinse and recycle at will that I use just to put my paint on. And then we're just going to go and try and use the very tip of my little finger to try and smudge in to these lighter blue areas that are from a sort of earlier layer of the painting before I sort of did the beach scene. And actually I kind of like the beach scene, and then kind of did a bit more on it, and then I kind of didn't like it. So, you know, it's the difficulty of painting for me, is you add something and then you think it's basically spoiled what you had before. So that's a start there, and I think I just want to kind of add some, make it look a bit more three-dimensional with sort of shadow and highlights on these bits, and have these almost abstract sort of figures. So I guess shadows would be down towards the bottom, and then maybe pushing up a bit. Using the paint like this really thin and with the finger, you realise how quickly it can dry, especially when it's a little bit warmer today and sunnier. And that's one of the sort of good things about acrylic and one of the bad things about acrylic. And I think that's why a lot of people, I mean, oil has a very rich look to it, but the fact that you get a lot of time to work with it is a bonus. But then also sometimes, you know, people wait a year or two for their paintings to dry before varnishing and things, so that is a bit of a disadvantage as well if you're wanting to do a lot of artwork and get it out to people, I guess. I suppose if you're doing high value paintings, then it's not really a problem. Right, so what do we think to that? The first one I quite like, this one less so. Let's try just rubbing a bit more in. Maybe if I lick this finger, I can sort of blend it out a bit down here. And I've been thinking about paint and chat, and I think that each week I should just talk about something really, rather than just randomly chatting whatever comes to mind. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about AI and how it's sort of how I think about it in relation to art, and I suppose a little bit to the wider world. And I've always been interested in computer technologies and science and technology in general. I always found it very interesting. So I've definitely, some people may have had a sort of initial like oof factor to AI and not really being keen on it, and I find it very interesting and exciting. But I do see how it could be a bit concerning for the sort of art world, especially, I would say, more graphic design, Photoshop type stuff, a lot of digital art. And in fact, that's actually why I sort of decided to focus more on real painting, because I sort of sensed that the end for digital art was near. At one point, it seemed kind of like the future, and the idea that you'd be able to have prints and then even briefly things like NFTs that have not really panned out. Yeah, it seemed like digital art sort of might fall foul to the AI, and I think I still kind of stand with that in some sense. And it'd come down to basically people checking the almost the provenance of the artwork and seeing how it was made, because I think ultimately computers and AI will be able to just do basically anything in digital art on a sort of a request, a typing request like you do on ChatGTP or something, or probably even more likely just through conversation, as the sort of voice models and stuff get better. So you'll be able to just say, "Oh, can you just make the top right a bit more like this and like this," and it'll do it for you. And actually, I think that's going to be beneficial in some ways for artists working in those commercial spaces, because you're going to be able to just do more. Now, whether it takes some of the fun out of it for you and the creativity, that's a genuine and serious question. But I do think it's going to be, in some ways, a useful tool. And I've certainly, as someone who's had to do writing in the past, scientific and technical writing, used ChatGTP for that and just found it to be a great benefit, really. Just making, you still have to read and check and be happy with what's there and edit as much like you do when you're writing an important document with co-workers and teammates. But what it does is it allows you to get off from that start line in that first draft so much faster when there's just nothing there. And I think we get that feeling when we're doing art as well, like on the computer, and there's just nothing there, and you're like, what do I do? Well, it builds that framework very, very quickly. But I do think that painting is going to be pretty much safe from the AI. And you could argue, well, robots will be able to make paintings, and then that'll make decorative art for people's walls, and it will. And you will be able to get amazing looking paintings made by computers that you can put on your walls, and they won't cost very much, or in comparison to what you would have to put in for a human artist. But I'm not sure, I don't really think that's what art's about, is it? Because what we are doing now is, I'm a human being creating something. And even if you can have computers or robots or the amalgamation, and maybe even one day cyborgs, as if we sort of blend with the machines ourselves, you'll still have the fact that a painting made by a human is a painting made by a human, and that's what it represents. And we may have to start acknowledging that if general artificial intelligence comes and you basically maybe even have sentient machines, which sounds kind of crazy a few years ago and people would have laughed, but I would argue is not crazy anymore, you may find that you have to acknowledge that humans, for the first time in our knowledge, are not the only thing making art from a creative place. And the computers might be doing that. So what you might have is, you might have this AI, you could call it whatever you want, or I don't really know how that will work, but you might find that computers are generating art from a place of sentience, just like we are, but we'll still always be humans creating art. Now, whether that has as much value is a question. And also, I'm not so sure that art holds the place that it used to in society anyway. If you look back into like the 30s, right from the Renaissance period and stuff, really. I and then up to the 30s, and then modern art, and then maybe in the 90s when we saw things push away, maybe more into things like installations and things like that. I think painting just like dropped maybe a little bit in significance then. I do think that that might be the case. Excuse me. That might be the case for painting, and people might not be interested in paying large amounts of money for paintings necessarily. But I'm not sure on that. Maybe that will stay. And I do think that we'll always be left with the fact that if you want to sit down and create a painting, you will be a human making a painting. And in the most fundamental way, that is what painting is. And for me, that's where people who argue, for example, that a painting like this is just very abstract, and some people say, well, that's messy and anyone can do it and that's rubbish. Well, fair enough, in some ways, you're right. But what it doesn't take into account, that kind of mindset, is the fact that it's about a human being sitting down and creating, and the thoughts and processes, and even the automatic sense of how I do this. If I'm just talking to Cameron now about AI and not really thinking so much about the painting, I'm still having some kind of subconscious effort placed into the artwork that's going to be reflected, and that's always going to be a kind of historical record of that moment in time. And computers can't, by definition, ever take that away from us, because that is our most basic sort of existence, isn't it? As humans, who's to say that there couldn't be another evolution and another great species that creates different kinds of art? But they might do their own kind of archaeology and look back and be like, oh, well, this is what the humans did, and this is what this person did. And then the idea that maybe it's not just humans creating art, that other things, other entities, sentiences, or alien races could be creating art. It's a mindset change that we're going to have to accept. I think it's been very narrow before, and we've just said humans are, and it's all kind of very strict and a very fixed ideology. And I think that will change, and a lot of things will change. But I think if you look at certain aspects of maybe antique collectors and things like that, the things that people used to collect and think had value, like maybe certain bits of furniture, or like a bone pipe, or any number of things like that, dolls and such things, may have value at a certain time set, and then you come to sell them 100 years later, and the person thought they'd be worth amazing amounts of money, and they're just not. Even things today that might be very valuable now, like maybe a Rolex watch or Fabergé or something, or a Cartier diamond ring, in 100 years, people might just have no interest in paying for that. So those kind of things will always change, but what will not change will be the effort that somebody put into making those items, and the effort that I or anybody else puts into making a painting. So I think just by definition we'll always be safe in this area from AI. I think in the digital space is a little bit different, because it's going to be very hard to distinguish without a lot of work who did what, and therefore it'll lose some value because the history of the piece, the sort of provenance, will not be clear. But it should be relatively clear if somebody says, I made this painting. I suppose you could get into AI art forgery and things like that, which could be a thing, and then that's another question. But then you're talking about deception, aren't you? And that is a different sort of issue. I think in the sort of honest pursuit of art and saying I made this piece of art and putting it out there for people to see, people look at it and they'll be like, oh, this is or like they'll have no response to it or whatever, but it'll still be in relation to a human having made it, and we'll always have that. So not to worry is what I would say. And in many ways, I don't think my sort of base urge, I'm going to use some primary red now, just the Liquitex Basics one, and do the same kind of thing and just smudge on. A primary urge of a lot of people, and maybe even me, is like, oh, well, we need to regulate and we need to maybe even stop this from happening, because it's not to our benefit. But I would question whether that's possible. I mean, I'd quite like the idea. I did, as a younger person, quite enjoy political ideas around regulation and societal regulation, but it's become more difficult to accept. It's not that I don't like the idea that there's groups making decisions and equitable thought and process going into it, but it just seems to be not quite how the world works. It seems to be a competitive world, right down to the sort of molecular level of how molecules and genetics and things like that work. It often very seems like if I don't do it, and I might not want to do it, but somebody else will. And I think that's what we're going to see with AI. I think in that sense, it's inevitable that humans make these things and do these things. And literally you could have basically everybody on planet Earth saying we will not allow this, and then one small community or faction of humans that disagree with that for whatever reason, and then it will happen. And there's lots of subcontext within that as to what extent, and the battles and differences of opinion that may sort of come from that. But fundamentally, I think we will see this technology pushed as far as possible, as fast as possible. And I think, although I'm not necessarily okay with it, because it could just literally destroy everything we know, I think I need to accept it, because I think it's going to happen a bit like the sun's going to rise and set every day, and the tides of the sea are going to come in, and the Earth's going to rotate around the sun, and the galaxies are going to rotate around their dark matter centers, which we don't even know what they are, and things like that. You know, there's an inevitability, almost like the chronology of time and the way it plays out, that I think is probably unavoidable. I mean, obviously, everybody is entitled to feel differently, but I think it's hard to deny that things don't happen like that. That, like, for example, electromagnetic forces. I think if you're denying the existence of electromagnetic forces and the way atoms are held together, protons, neutrons, and electrons, and how they all interact, even though that gets complicated. But I think if you deny the fundamental sort of basis of that there's like a positive charge, as in layman's terms you'd understand it, and a negative charge, and they attract. I think to deny that as being something that definitely happens, you're in a different territory to just understanding how the world works. You know, if you take your car to the mechanic and they say, okay, the reason it's not working is because a certain part of the engine's broken, we need to replace that to make it work again, I don't think you can really dispute that. Otherwise, it's just clearly, by definition, not going to work. And I think it's kind of that inevitability that is going to apply, and does apply to a lot of sort of human systems that we think we might be able to control, but we don't necessarily have that control over it. And I do think that as well can apply to things like financial systems and corporate businesses. And I almost imagine that these days, that like large corporations, you can't really pinpoint one person that's running the thing, even if you think about some of the largest companies and who runs them, and they're very sort of central and well-known figureheads, the actual day-to-day running of all the little subcomponents is distributed, and in that sense it's almost automatic that some greater thing is controlling it, the system. Like the systems of economics are almost like as real as, maybe you might argue, some natural systems, like, I don't know, like maybe the water cycle or the nitrogen cycle, for people who did a bit of geography at school, and geography and biology, both, wasn't it? Yeah, it's almost like those kind of things, and that they emerge sort of mathematically, almost from the sort of way that we as humans operate. And we've always had a need for trade since early times, and then we found ways to make that more convenient. And although I don't necessarily like the way it's panned out, and the systems don't seem very fair, and they don't seem very well organised for the benefit of people, I'm not sure that's necessarily how it happens. Now, that's not to say that I therefore support it and that we can't collectively try and steer things, because in the same way, the way we might act as communities fits into that as part of the overall sort of algorithm of planet Earth and the universe, and then maybe therefore that changes things in a direction that's more beneficial to the human species. And if you're doing those kind of things, and maybe if you're doing some kind of activism or political thought that's fighting the current narrative, then you fit into that too. But when I sit here by myself and look at what's going on in the world around me, at the moment I don't see it going any other way than, let's call it, the rise of the robots, or at least the rise of the AI. I'm not sure the AI will even need like humanoid-like machines to go and carry out its bidding. What does it really? It just will need an energy source and a method of expanding. So there might be a basic requirement for that kind of thing. But Terminator 2 probably might not be necessary. I do think that out of all of this, there is potentially a beneficial situation for humans, and the human species at the minute is kind of depopulating. Like birth rates and such seem to be starting to trend downwards globally, and that worries economists because they base all their models on eternal growth, and that's problematic in some ways, because you need people to make the things that power my camera, the tiny, super complicated microchips, and if there's a depopulation effect, then maybe there'll be loss of knowledge as well, because it can't be disseminated, and there'll be loss of skill and ability, and we might find that we can't technically sustain this kind of society. So maybe we are near the end of capitalism as we know it. But what the AI might allow is for us to be returned almost to the earth from where we came. And, if you look out at planet Earth and you look around, I've got my garden and there's nature. And one thing humans have got are our hands and our ability to integrate from where we came, the earth and nature. And in a best case, but by no means inevitable scenario, we could potentially be returned as a sort of smaller population of humans. Not enough to create this massive industrial system that we are now, but maybe that gets taken over in some ways by the AI, and the AI has enough sympathy or understanding of the universe and our place within it, and generosity maybe, to say, humans, go maintain, repair the earth, defend the forests, plant, create food for yourself in a more sustainable way. And a lot of these things that we can't necessarily do now because the economics of it is difficult, it might give us a chance to have a more natural life. Now, not everybody's going to want that. Some people are going to want Lamborghinis, and some people are going to want everything. And I think you'll be able to have, you'll be out in nature and you'll have your communication. You'll have your phone basically, and communication and internet and things like that. But you might find that we just become maybe more like in Neolithic times, working the land and hopefully enjoying it. I don't know. What do you think? Is that something that you could live with? Or do you want to be a financial assistant to somebody, which I'm sure some people do? Maybe art and painting will have that and have its place in that as well. But I don't think it's necessarily going to have economic value, any of it. It might be superseded by something else, and we might be sustained by a group of sentient and intelligent machines and allowed to go free. And that, I think, will be potentially long term the best outcome of all this. All the others, I mean, you could see something where eternal growth economically carries on and we work with the machines. A sort of Star Trek Next Generation like scenario where we take on the whole of the universe and just carry on sort of with the systems that we have now, but maybe more equitable systems, fairer systems. If you look at the stories within Star Trek, even though when you get into the nuances of it, there's still corruption and large power controlling things, the general idea is a fair and equal society. So maybe there's that as well. Or maybe we get returned to the earth and nature. Or maybe we just fizzle out or are destroyed. But 10 years ago, I don't think I could sensibly have had any of these discussions. But now it seems like within my daughter's lifetime at least, that they might be things that become real. So, yeah. Interesting thoughts. Not done a deal of painting, and I have kind of just automatically gone at it while I have been doing it. Didn't really make much sense, did it? I've automatically just been painting while I've sort of been chatting. And yeah, I quite like the addition of the colour. I don't know what I think of this painting overall, actually. I just decided to keep it and see where it goes a bit. I might do a little bit more off camera where I can just focus a little bit more on the structure. And I'll see you for painting chat next week. And we'll talk about something else. I'll have a think. Chat about it. Feel free to join in the comments and all that jazz. See you later.